the Danish team Heroic are quite different from all the other teams, all the peers who are around their level. The teams that are outside of the top 10, but people look at as potentially they can cause some upsets. What makes them different is, first of all, they have legit upset potential and always have, with all the variations they've had ever since they first formed that core that became Team X, basically after Magix had left, gone to Dignitas, and then they became Heroic. And so that might sound like an obvious statement. Oh, they've got legit upset potential. And my point is, some of the teams who might be like the 14th, 15th best team only have upset potential against the right opponent on a very specific map. And maybe it has to be one map, or maybe they're just okay on maps, and therefore it's some player having a way above and beyond performance than you'd normally expect from them. That's not actually legit upset potential. That's like extreme outlier. It can happen. The point of Heroic is you put them into almost any tournament and they are going to get upsets, and they're going to get them partly for some of the reasons I'm going to outline, from having a legit system, in-game leader, map pool, quality mix of players in a unique formation. And so this is one of the reasons why over the last few months they've quickly grown into one of the underdog teams that I really enjoy watch playing. And I'm always looking forward to them being in the next tournament, because they do cause upsets seemingly every tournament they go to. They beat a team that on paper probably should be better than them, more talented than them, in theory better on some of the maps than them. So what's interesting is it's not like they've kept the same lineup the whole time and then that's part of the story. You know, it's just the players playing fantastic. They've had a whole gang of roster moves, some of which on paper should have been detrimental, some of which should have killed this upset potential and made them an irrelevant team out. And yet they have continued to remain a quality team. And I actually think right now the lineup that they've just put together, bringing in Juggy, potentially could be the best lineup that they've actually ever fielded under that team and go further than the other ones, as opposed to just getting a few upsets, and actually legitimately make some deeper runs, like make some playoffs of bigger tournaments, not just have to go to tier 2 tournaments and maybe make the playoffs and then losing the best of 3. So the interesting thing was the first core that they had was basically a whole bunch of veteran players. They had Glaive, who obviously was a source player and then was around early on at the top level as an in-game leader in CSGO, was the Western Wolves in-game leader, but at this point in time in Heroic, not the in-game leader anymore, hadn't been the in-game leader before even in Copenhagen Wolves. They had Snappy, who was a 1.6 player. We're talking like 2010, around that time. His teams got pretty decent, but then very kind of faded off. And actually, he was the in-game leader of this Heroic team. We had Modi, obviously one of the best players in the world. If you go back to like 2011, like a real star player, but a player who had like kind of a simple reputation, simple than the Ukrainian player we're talking about. Yeah, you know, they're incredibly talented, but they couldn't get into the bigger teams because people thought they were bad teammates or they were corrosive in terms of their attitude. And you had Freeze, who in the latter days of 1.6 was one of the best AWPers, but never really got to that level in CSGO and had just settled into just being like an okay AWPer who'd gradually moved down the Danish ladder because there wasn't much space for him. So they had these 4 veterans who've all played CSGO many, many years, played in a bunch of teams. Some of them had success in past games. In fact, all to some degree had success in past games. And then they added in, when Magix left, who did they get? They got this guy, Valde, and he actually turned out to be this star player. Now, he's not so young, because, I mean, the guy's 21 now, so you can't really call him like a young player, but in terms of his career, very young, had barely been around in CSGO at all, and you bring him into the team, and he starts playing at tier 2, like a real star player, and since then, he's really been the guy who stood out in that team, beyond even Glaive, who obviously left and went to Astralis. So, now you look at the team they've got. So Glaive went to Astralis and became the in-game leader there, has had unbelievable success, won the major, etc., and gone back to in-game leading, which again, I'll stress he did not do when he was in Heroic. Freeze has been removed finally. That's interesting because that had always been a piece where back in when they were SK, this core, people said that he had a big say in a lot of the decisions, etc., and I always thought he was kind of underwhelming there. He was just an average player. Modi stuck around, Snappy stuck around, and then now they're in a position where and Valde's still there. So now the 2 players they've added since, they added Nico after Glaive left, Nico Niko, but not the Bosnian one, being a guy who's like a young prospect, who seems decent enough. And then they've added more recently Juggy, who's even more of like a absolute up-and-comer and a guy where people look at him and have a lot of talent. And then we really want to see what he's going to do, though, because he's barely played at all competitively. So now they're not that team of old vets who know how to play, and then the young star, and then Snappy really showing what he can do as in-game leader. That's a lot of what got them their upsets before. Now they're in a position where they've got some vets, they've got Snappy, and they've got Modi. They're the vets, But now they've got the quality player who was an up-and-comer last year, Valde, who's now becoming a legit star. And then they've got these two young talents, and they don't need both of them to go off. But now they've got a quality three-man talent trio, and then they've got the vets. And Modi, if you're putting him as your third or fourth best player, pretty good player overall. So they've now got some talent to work with, as well as Snappy's system. And so one of the things I noticed about them early wasn't just like some of the names I recognised and Valde being very good, because I watched initially to see, is it just this Valde good guy's going to be some like dominating lower tier player, and one day he's going to be in Dignitas Astral, so I'll start watching now. And I quickly saw, Valde's good, but this team isn't just about that, and it isn't just about the names. A lot of it's coming from the system they're using. Like, this team is a real team. They actually have an approach to the game that makes logical sense, that they apply again and again, over and over, and that's why you see consistent results, which have led in the past and now, interesting, this is one of the interesting things, to them having these three specialist maps. With their old lineup and the new one, which are fairly different lineups, they've been able to consistently play against the best teams in the world and score upsets on Overpass, Cobblestone, and Nuke. And that's been big, and that's been one of the reasons why they've been able to get these upsets. I mean, a key to being an underdog team and being able to legitimately do something when you play the really elite teams is you have to be very, very good. You have to be a specialist on a couple of maps. Because if you're just good on a bunch of maps, they're going to be amazing on some of theirs because they're the best teams in the world. And when they get to that map, they're just going to dust you off completely. Whereas, as Gambit recently showed Virtus.pro at DreamHack Vegas, if you give... And Gambit showed North before that. If you give an underdog team that's very good at one map or two, one of those maps, and you're very good at it as well, now you're giving them a legit chance to beat you. Whereas if you put, because Virtus.pro is a much better team than Gambit, but if you put VP against a team that's like a decent team, but they're not god tier on any maps, VP will just handle them, and it won't even be a game in that sense. I also noticed early on, and continuing to now, that even though, so initially they were breaking out with amazing games on Cobblestone, and then they were an early adopter of Nuke, and then they showed us a little bit on Overpass against some of the Overpass teams. So you could look and see early on, this is a legit team, they compete well against teams, they seem like they have good preparation. But a key thing that I noticed early on was they were also a team that wasn't just relying on those specialist maps. Like, they didn't just always go to Cobblestone, they didn't just always take the choice to make it a Nuke game if they could. They were actually, quite early on, until now, always picking the map in a series based on the opponent. So they'd take their strengths, they'd look what the opponent's weakness was, and try and go as far towards that as they could. Because remember, a key about a best-of-3 series is, in theory, unless the opponent knows you got like a one-up and just chooses to take that one out, like people used to do Dust 2 against Mouse, if they're playing you like you're a real team and they're a real team, they're going to take out, generally, at the first ban rotation, their worst map, the map they don't want to play most of all. So that means their second worst map, or the map they want to play second least of all, is the one that's going to be available. Now, in that scenario, whenever it lined up, and in fact, even when sometimes it didn't line up with their strengths, with their specialist maps, I saw that Heroic would consistently pick that map. And then what they would do with all the other maps available in the pool is, second rotation, the opponent could still only remove one map. They'd have all their other maps available, assume they didn't pick them all there, and they're going to be able to, in theory, push towards getting one of those maps as the decider. Now, they didn't win that many of the deciders, and they obviously didn't win many big series. In fact, very few once we got past like the specialist events. So I saw that this is a team approach, this is a mind behind the team, and as a result, Snappy, the more and more I watched his team, the more impressed I am, because he's not someone from 1.6 who was a person you thought of in this role at all. So to me, that's a sign of a good in-game lead. This is one of the things early on that I noticed about MSL. In his early teams, when they started to get a decent map pool, that they didn't, again, just go to the strength of Cobblestone every day and night. They would pick based on the opponent. And that's why when they got to this top peak at Epicenter, I actually think they had a chance to be a very, very good team. And it was just underperformance against the elite teams that's really cost them. They couldn't get past that hurdle. So the reason why I'm making this video now is because IEM Katowice is coming up. And the format for IEM Katowice is where you're in a 6-team best-of-1 round robin. So essentially, the simple way to say it is you play each opponent in the group once, and you're going to play 5 games. And then, based on your record, you can either go to the playoffs, the top 3 teams, or you're just going to be going home and you're going to be watching the rest of the tournament on Twitch or from the spectating stand, from the crowd, like the rest of us. So the interesting detail is, if you look at the group they've gotten the harder group. Heroic on paper is the worst team in the group. And yet actually, if you look at the strengths of the other teams in this group, I actually think that Heroic is going to not only cause an upset, but multiple upsets. And that they are actually going to be the key to deciding who gets out of this group. Because I think it's fairly unlikely they will actually get out, as I'll go into, because they still are the worst team on paper. But they have a very good chance to cause upsets. And so I think the teams that don't get upset by Heroic are the ones that naturally are going to get out. And so I think when it comes down to like, oh, will it be North? Will it be Na'Vi who take that third spot? I think it's going to be whichever one didn't lose to Heroic. So that's why Heroic is going to play a massive role as the spoiler. And we'll get into a lot of this. One last factor I will mention before we go on is that Heroic is also a team. Not only have they got new talent and they've still got a good map pool, but the removal of Dust 2, in theory, helps them. Because there's two factors to Dust 2 being removed. First of all, it means all those teams who like Dust 2, there's a couple in this group, actually can no longer play it against them. Meanwhile, Heroic, in basically all their incarnations, didn't like Dust 2. It wasn't a good map for them. And they struggled on it and just used to go away from it as much as they could. But more than that, it's not like Dust 2's been removed and then in comes a map that everyone's playing and therefore, well, are they good on Inferno? Because, yeah, they're not playing Inferno at the moment. But you know what? Who is playing Inferno? Very few teams. And it's not like any of the teams in this group, except maybe North, are really actually daring to put it out there and will maybe even be willing to let it go all the way through and pick it. Because remember, in this sort of a ban system, you ban out 6 maps and there's 1 map left. So you're not it's not like a best of 3 where someone can pick it immediately if you don't ban it. So this is a team, Heroic, that has been consistently overperforming and getting upsets. Seemingly every event. I mean, since Valde joined, you go through some of the big upsets they've had. So they went to Power LAN, which is this tournament, a Danish LAN that had Astralis at it. Admittedly, this is Astralis before Glaive, but still, all those fantastic players. Essentially everyone that's in Astralis now, except Carrigan, was there instead of Glaive. And there was Dignitas, but Dignitas was playing without Rubino because it was in Denmark, so they had AZ as a stand-in there. They beat Astralis in a best of 3. They beat Dignitas in a best of 3. They went to Starlad at Season 2, the one that was won by NIP with Makalele over G2, if you remember, the one that VP and Na'Vi famously failed at in the group stage. And they beat Astralis there as well in the best of 1. They went to DreamHack Bucharest, which is the next event. They beat Envious in an epic overtime game on Mirage. When Glaive left, okay, is that it? Is that the end of the story? You know, they're bringing this young guy, Nico. Is that all they're going to do? No. They go to Northern Arena in Montreal. They beat Team Liquid on Cobblestone, I think it was, which was at the time we thought one of Team Liquid's best maps. It's Team Liquid with Pimp when Simple had already gone. They beat G2 at that tournament. Also a very legit result. G2 obviously went to the final, were 1 map from winning the tournament. They went to IEM Oakland after that. They beat SK Gaming. Obviously one of the best teams in the world. The team that actually went to the final of that tournament. They beat Mouse Sports. Okay, yeah, Mouse Sports in their slump. Mouse Sports not that great a team. They still had Nico in the lineup. They still had Chris J. They still had all these players who had some decent results in the past. A core that had some okay results and certainly knew how to take care of Tier 2. And then most recently they went to DreamHack Leipzig, and this is before they got in Juggy. And they didn't manage to get a sick result there. They got to the semi-finals. It was more of a Tier 2, Tier 3 event, this LAN. And they got to the semis. They played God B's big team. And they could... There's a world in which they could have won 2-0. It was a very close second map, but they ended up losing 2-1, and they went out in the semi-finals. Now, if you look at the lineup of the team, this is where it gets very interesting. Because like I say, since the last lineup, the original one with the 4 vets and Valde, was kind of a known quantity, it was really on Valde. Like, he had to just go even more ham for them to have a chance. And then Muddy was kind of in a revival over that spring to summer from his time in SK. He was looking very good. And Glaive was like a very solid third party. So you were like, okay, we've got a decent team here, but it's all about the development of Valde. Okay, the team still is very much about Valde. He is clearly the star player. But the key for me is he actually has developed over the last 6 months. This guy was, when he burst out on the scene, okay, aside from domestic results where players nearly always feel more comfortable because they get a lot more chances to play those elite players that are from their country and play mixes with them and stand in with them and all the rest of it. When they go against the international competition, there's a reason why I always describe the competitive scene as rungs on a ladder. It's like you got to step up from online play to like offline at small lands, to offline at medium-sized lands, to offline at big lands, to beating good teams at big lands, to winning best of 3s at big lands, to making semis at big lands, to making finals, to winning tournaments. You know, some players go step by step on the rungs of the ladder. Some players go up the ladder, never go any further, and go down steps. And you can kind of measure their career by the height of where they go to. So it's being a superstar player, if you want to be on one day, you have to measure it by these rungs and kind of check it off as they go. And you can never assume someone's going to go past that. Some people are so amazing, just prodigies at the game, simple type individuals, Nico, that they can just jump up 5 rungs of the ladder instantly. Not many people can do that. Even great players sometimes have to go step by step along the way. So the interesting thing is where Valde was at when Heroic first formed as this organization was he used to dominate Tier 2 and online games. This guy looked fantastic. Like actually at that time, he looked like he was going to be the next Danish great player, not Valde. Config still hadn't fully blossomed. This guy looked like maybe he was going to nudge these guys aside. I mean, his team was beating the likes of those teams on LAN, and maybe he's the next guy who's going to be in Astralis. Now, that didn't end up happening, because what happened was, initially, when he got his chances against the Tier 1 teams and he went to the biggest LANs, it wasn't as good, actually. He dropped off, his level dropped off, he couldn't have the same impact. But over the last few months and the last few big LANs he's gone to, he's started to really get comfortable. He's starting to settle, and I think he's starting to understand, especially with a lot of those vets gone, these young guys coming in, that he is the star player. There's something about that mentality of going from being just a player and a new player to the competitive scene like he was, and really developing like the star player, the routine, what you're going to do every game, and then let the rest of the team play around you. And so in that sense, he looks to me like he is a legit star at this point in time. Like I've said this before, I'm glad he didn't get the call up to go to North or Astralis. I think that would have been something that could have crippled his career. It would have been similar to AZ in Dignitas in 2014, where they would have made him play an off role. He wouldn't have had his spots. He would have felt the pressure of being boosted up too early, and then it could have set him back years. Instead, I think it's good that he's in Heroic, the third best Danish team, because I actually think this is the year where he shows us if he can be a potential superstar player. And he shows us, and he's going to be the star player and the firepower, the central firepower of this team. And therefore, he's got time to fully develop. And then, towards the end of this year, that's where we can see him go to a North, to an Astralis. It's also worth pointing out, in terms of the guy's actual style of play, he wouldn't necessarily be suited to those teams right now based on who their best players are. Like in the past of how they used to play before they made Device be the AWPer all the time in Astralis, you would have said maybe put Valde more towards what Device is doing. But obviously, first of all, you're not going to replace Device, so that's not on the table anyway. But the opening that's opened up there is, but now Device doesn't do that much. Now he is the AWPer most of the time, and now he is playing pick-off-op style within the tactic. He hangs back. He's not the guy going in first a lot of time. So as a result, I actually think it's more about how Dupree does in Astralis. Because if Dupree, who now, he's given up some of that entry fragging role, it feels like, to Kjaerbye. So if instead Dupree has any drop-off in his play, that's where one day perhaps there's a possibility for Valde to be in a team of the caliber of Astralis. Now, in terms of North, obviously they have just loaded up with talent. It's going to be very tough to get a role there. Because again, who's the best player in North? It's Magix, right? Well, that's probably the sort of role you'd want Valde to be in. Now, admittedly, people are going to say, well, Valde did get to stand in instead of Magix at ECS Season 2. Right? That doesn't really count. By the way, Valde did quite badly at that LAN, but that doesn't really count because, first of all, that team had almost no time to practice together. They went immediately from E-League Season 2 pretty much. They'd already been a team that were on the road for months or weeks and weeks, much all the tournaments pretty much. They were wrecked in terms of the stamina and endurance, and he was just coming straight into someone else's system that's totally based around them and just being plugged in. So, and also, like something like 4 out of the 7 maps he played or something were against SK Gaming, sure with Fox, but still one of the best cores and a team that we all know is very tough to play and know how to adapt. So I think he was really throwing the deep end there. The problem is, again, you're not going to replace Magix. Like, it's very unlikely you're going to get his spot. But here's where it gets interesting. If you look at North now, so they brought in AZ, and they keep claiming between AZ and Config, maybe it's Config who's going to settle into more of the lurk role. That's where there's an opening. If Config can't do that role well, or they kick someone else and bring Config back to the aggressive role, either one of these players, that's where a Valde could slide in there. Or, if for some reason Astralis ever changes players, I feel like Config's the player they're going to take and put into their team, and therefore a spot opens up in North that way, and now maybe in goes Valde instead of maybe a departing Dupree or whoever it might be in that particular scenario. So I do feel like Valde, this is his year, and he's the star player of this team. For Snappy, the interesting thing is, like I said, he had no rep. He wasn't some like super duper in-game leader in 1.6. Don't even think he played the in-game leader role for most of the time. I can't exactly remember who did though, because I think their teams really changed him up. Interestingly enough, he was a very average player in 1.6. He had some history of a little bit of a success. He was in the Roskilde Ravens team that actually managed to place top 4 at an IEM European Championship, which at the time was big, but then they dropped right off. That was like one of those one-off miracle runs. And then towards the end of 1.6, like end of 2011, yeah, he was in this Nexus lineup that was like okay. It was a bunch of him and some of his ex-teammates. They mixed up a lot in the Danish scene back then, but they weren't really that impressive. Like, they weren't going to do a whole lot, quite frankly. And yeah, he seemed like a flash in the pan in terms of his chance to do anything really. But as an in-game leader, like I told you, as I've watched the team more and more, I've started to see these qualities of a good team. Qualities that come from having an in-game leader who builds the system out, who makes sure people know their roles within it, who changes roles when he makes in-game leading changes, who decides the maps you play, and who works on what you're good at on those maps. And then once these trends and consistent aspects begin to manifest that are positive, now you can see the work of a good in-game leader. And so he's impressing me in that sense. I think he's probably the most underrated in-game leader in the world. Now, the other one of the core that's remained is Modi. And the interesting thing about Modi is, in the early days of CSGO, like let's say up until the end of 2013, he was still a pretty good rifler. He had times where he was a pretty strong player, but then he had this weird period where he was taking over being the in-game leader of Fnatic, and then he was replaced by Pronax. They obviously went on to bigger things, and he really was in the doldrums for a while. It looked like he quit completely. Then he came back with this SK team. Now, interestingly enough, he did get pretty good in the summer of last year. He had a little bit of form where he was looking real solid. He was looking like he was getting that rifle back, where he was looking like just a really good player again. But that kind of faded away again. And once he got into Heroic and he got these newer players around him, it feels like he's taken a bit of a step back and his performance has gone down a bit. With that said, though, he's still solid enough. And the key to me is with these two young talents that they've got in Nico and Juggy, if only one of those becomes good, then you can slot Modi in as like the third best player in the team. And now he can certainly play that role. And now you can put your lineup skill-wise against a bunch of good teams in the world and have a chance in terms of firepower. Now, if that doesn't happen, or while he's waiting for that to happen, he can certainly be the second best player in the team and have some good performances and battle with Nico to see who's the second best. And then you can still say that they're not too light on firepower. In a group like this, they're light on firepower because they've got the hardest group. But in general, I think that's a decent enough baseline and a kind of a placeholder in terms of Modi as a star to let the others develop and have their chance and see who actually ends up being good. Because you've got these two younger talents, these two newer talents in Nico and Juggy. Now, Nico, so far, has looked pretty good in terms of fragging. Like, he's the guy who puts numbers on the board. Now, in terms of his overall game, that still has to develop a lot. But I actually think like he's the one who, at the moment, is the closest to being like the second star behind Valde. Juggy's the brand new guy. Now, he clearly has talent. You look at some of the online games I've watched. There's something there, but he is so unproven offline. He played so few LANs and basically nothing of any real international caliber. So as a result, you really can't know what to make of him. Like, if anything of it translates, now it's interesting. Now maybe Stampy's working with talent as well as a system. Obviously, that's another thing. You're bringing a young guy into your new system. You have to make him work in that sense. But at the moment, I don't know what to make of this guy, so I haven't really seen him in any games that mattered. So I'm very much looking to see how he plays, because the old lineup were veterans, and this lineup is very much newer players. There's only really Snappy and Modi from the old school in that sense. So, with the old lineup, as I said, they were one of the key details was, okay, they showed off early on that they were really good on Cobble and Overpass. And obviously a bunch of teams don't play one of those maps or don't like one of those maps, but didn't necessarily ban them directly because there was maps like Nuke, like maps that you didn't want to play at the time that you might get out of the equation. So, interestingly enough, it wasn't just that. It was that this was one of the teams, along with Dignitas and VP, that were very early adopters of Nuke. These guys were real early on it in that sense, and they went hard at it. And so as a result, that's part of why they were able to get themselves into the equation, where maybe in terms of upsets, they looked better than they were, but they weren't really going to win any tournaments, because that wore off eventually. More people started to play Nuke, more people started to learn how to play Nuke, and then also, unfortunately, you got the dominance of the very good Nuke teams, the VP, Dignitas, NIPs of the world, where you also, if you play against them, are just going to outright lose anyway. So, interestingly enough, beyond those three maps, they still were pretty decent in terms of map pool. Like, their Mirage was pretty underrated. They only tended to lose to pretty good Mirage teams. Their Train, okay, admittedly, that was very up and down. Still, they could play it, and a lot of them, those losses still mainly came to good Train teams, but the point is they were never going to upset anyone who was good on Train. Dust 2 and Cash were non-existent. They didn't play Cash, and Dust 2 was terrible for this core. But they made the changes. They came in with Nico, and obviously I can't judge them with Juggy because they've only played a few online games, but in terms of the Nico era lineup, right, Cobblestone, Overpass, still fantastic, still very good. I mean, the Cobble nowadays, so many teams play it, and so many teams have got routine on it, that the only teams they're really losing in general to is other teams who play that map. And the problem at the moment is I feel like Cobble's a map that's really out there. There's tons of teams play it, so it's going to be very hard to win a lot on it, but they're still pretty decent on it. They're still solid on it. The key for me is like Overpass. If they can keep that going, because the problem is, actually, I will say this. One thing that was interesting about their Cobblestone I noticed was I remember seeing Lurpus and I think Snappy some sort of comments from them where they implied that you shouldn't think of Cobblestone anymore as being super T-sided, because obviously the best T-sided teams we think of, like classic early 2016 Na'Vi, we think of Virtus.pro at their best. They would just like, they could lose CT side, then come and dust you off like 10 rounds T side and do it pretty consistently. Now, Snappy's theory was that actually the map isn't so T-sided anymore. Now, interestingly enough, if you look at his team with Nico in the mix, when they're playing on LAN on that map, actually, they win CT side a lot, and they put up double-digit CT side rounds. So that's an interesting quirk that if they play at Katowice, to keep your eye out in that sense. Now, once you go over to the other maps, Overpass, Nuke still remain very strong maps for them. On Overpass, it's actually their T side that I think is better than a lot of the other teams out there. Like, obviously, that's the CT-sided map at its heart, and everyone should be able to, if you're decent, put up 9 to 10 rounds in theory. But this team really has a solid routine on the T side. I think it's really interesting that the Danish scene in general is the scene that has been the most embracing and most effective on Overpass of any scene in the world. All the Danish teams have in-game leaders. I mean, we can include Kerrigan in this because obviously he's not in the Danish scene anymore, but he's a Danish in-game leader. All of them get good on Overpass, understand the T side of Overpass, and develop these really good, but all different, slight tweaks on the same metagame of how you play the T side. And as a result, they're all dangerous on Overpass. So it's the T side of Overpass you want to watch for when this team plays that. And then on Nuke, it's also the T side there. Again, this isn't a team that runs off like 13 CT rounds. No, actually, the reason they get wins on Nuke was having a good T side. So, Train and Mirage still remain maps that, like, it's very much up and down. And if they get a team that's good on Train and Mirage, they're just going to outright lose, most likely. Cash is still non-existent, and Inferno's coming in the mix, and at the moment, they're not playing it at all. So, in theory, this is a 3-map team, but they've got 2 more depending on if they're lower teams. Now, there is no lower team than Heroic at Katowice, so they're only going to be using those other maps for bans, basically. Because remember, you ban out 6 maps and there's 1 remaining. So they're not going. Here's the interesting detail, okay, is that their group, remember, is SK Gaming, VP, North, C9, Na'Vi. Now, here's the interesting detail. When we match Heroic up against those teams, so SK Gaming's best maps, in theory, I mean, we've only seen them play 1 line with Thorps, Train, Overpass, Mirage. Now, one of those maps, the guys from Heroic want to play. They want to play Overpass, right? But here's the detail. They might be able to get to Overpass because SK doesn't like to play Cash. SK hasn't shown us anything on Inferno so far. And SK probably doesn't want to play Cobble. They've seemed to really go away from that. So sure, Train and Mirage are there, and that'd be tough for the guys from Heroic to win against SK on. But Train and Mirage can probably be gotten out of the map pool by Heroic by using that for their bans, and SK has a whole bunch of stuff to ban themselves. So I actually think there's a chance they can play SK on Overpass, and therefore there is upset potential there. When they play Virtus.pro, Virtus.pro's best maps, Train, Nuke, Cobble. Now, interestingly enough, VP, just like Heroic, doesn't like Cash. VP hasn't shown us anything on Inferno, and VP at the moment has been staying away from Overpass. And we know Overpass is a strong map for the guys from Heroic. It's been a map that VP in general has gone away from being very good on, like they were in the middle of 2016, because they've got so many other strong maps. So even though VP has an amazing map pool, and VP certainly could force Heroic to ban Inferno or something, that certainly could be the case. I actually think there's a chance that because VP is the best team in the world on Nuke, and they're incredibly good on it, that VP actually might let them play Nuke and just play Nuke heads up against them, just like they let Gambit play Cobble when they were at DreamHack Vegas. And so they're going to have a chance there because they are underrated Nuke team, even though obviously VP is still better than them in that sense. When they play North, now North has a very wide map pool, not as deep a map pool as some of the other teams I've mentioned before, but a wide one, as in they're not amazing on all the maps, but they can play a lot of them. So their maps are Mirage, Nuke, let me think, Overpass, Cobble. They're the 4 that they really want to play. Now, 3 of those 4 maps are maps that the guys from Heroic want. So all they have to do is get Mirage out there. Not only that, but North also bans Cash, and North doesn't like Train, and that's a map that obviously is not that good a map for the guys from Heroic. So actually, even though North has an amazing map pool, Heroic, I feel like, can actually force their hand on the pick ban there, and I think we're going to end up on something like Cobblestone, perhaps, actually, because MSL has consistently shown that even if the other team's really good on it, like a Gambit, he'll also let them play Cobblestone because he thinks they can beat them on it, and he thinks they can be very good. By the way, he's not always wrong. I mean, obviously, North almost beat VP on Cobble to go through to the semi-finals of the Major and had an amazing letdown in that sense. An amazing comeback by VP. So I actually think there's a chance this can be Cobblestone. So again, good upset chance there for the guys from Heroic, especially because obviously North is domestic rivalry, right? So you go to Cloud9 now. Cloud9's best maps, admittedly, they've lost a lot recently, so it's hard to really pinpoint them as much. But in their prime, okay, Train, Mirage, and then you would have said Dust 2, but it's out, so maybe we'll put Overpass in there as the third one. I mean, Cobble at times was okay, but it feels like they've gone away from that. But here's the thing. Cloud9 always bans Nuke. They don't want to play Nuke, so that's straight out of the equation. Does Cloud9 want to play Inferno? I mean, if they wouldn't adopt Nuke, will they play Inferno? We don't really know. So I feel like actually Heroic can force the ban there, where when I figured it out, I think they're going to end up on something like Overpass, which I think Cloud9 will take as a measure they can settle with, because Heroic can ban out Train and Mirage. So I actually think in that world that if we're playing Overpass, or it could be Cobble, I think probably Overpass. In this world, they certainly have upset potential there. And then the last team, Na'Vi. Now, again, Na'Vi's a team that's been up and down recently, but we'd look at them overall and say best maps, probably Mirage, Train, Cobble. Now, one of those maps is one that Heroic wants, but Na'Vi also don't like Cash. Na'Vi might have to ban Nuke, even though they played it a little bit. Will they really want to play it against Heroic, who are very good on it? No one knows what's going to happen in terms of Inferno. That's a real wild card right there. So I actually think that Na'Vi might be willing to play Heroic on Cobble. So the key thing right here is, in a very realistic manner, in all 5 games, Heroic can potentially get one of their 3 really good maps. They can actually, against all these teams. Now, a couple of those teams are fantastic on those maps. Like North is pretty good on Cobble, and VP is amazing on Nuke, and Na'Vi plays a pretty decent Cobble at the moment. But in general, they can get maps they want against all 5 opponents. That's why there's very good upset potential in this group. Now, I actually think against teams like C9 and Na'Vi, the fact that Dust 2's gone is a big help as well. They can't go to that. Having a domestic rivalry with North, and then Inferno being in there as a wild card, really means that if North don't embrace Inferno, then absolutely that can just be a death match, and we can have some of the Danish players just going head to head and see who comes out on top. Obviously, North has the more firepower in that sense. SK, they can get good maps against. There's no Dust 2 anymore, which was kind of SK's saviour over the last 6 months. VP, I think the key is that they can force them to ban Overpass. Now, the key thing here is you play 5 games. It's still very unlikely, it's still pretty unlikely that Heroic's going to the playoffs. Because to get to the playoffs, you probably need three map wins. Or you need some sort of mad 2 map wins, and then over the right opponents who beat the right opponents and therefore give you some sort of tiebreaker. But with that said, I will say the outside chance for Heroic to make the playoffs is they have to have their upsets first. But beyond that, because there's actually quite a lot of parity in terms of either firepower or just level at the moment between like SK and VP, for example, they can beat each other. Or Na'Vi and North, they can probably beat each other. And maybe North can beat VP, and maybe Na'Vi can beat SK. There's a lot of other ways that all these things can go that can also help out Heroic. And in some miracle world, maybe they can make players. But I would pick them personally. I think they're just going to win like 2 upsets out of these 5, I'll say. And I think that there's a world in which they can also win 3. Winning 3 out of 5 is still tough, but they're going to get the maps they want at least. And more importantly, they're going to be playing a couple of Cobbles, a couple of Overpass, maybe a Nuke. Now, if I had to pick the ones I think they're most likely to get the upset against, I would probably say, I mean, the obvious ones on paper are the North, C9 and Na'Vi ones. Like, I actually think the C9 and Overpass is a really good chance to get an upset. That's probably my number 1 I'd put down. And then I think possibly Na'Vi on Cobble is the second best one. And my third most likely upset is going to be North if they play Cobble. I think these are the ones in that order most likely, because Na'Vi at the moment aren't blowing everywhere in terms of firepower to necessarily be able to win that map. And I think the North one will be tough, just because North look like they have potential to improve. But I think C9 and Na'Vi, they're the teams that have really got to watch out for Heroic when we get to Katowice. And going forwards, this isn't a tournament you can really expect them to make the playoffs. Depending on the development of Juggy and Nico. Juggy's obviously the main player to watch for this tournament because we haven't really seen him play. Depending on which one of those can develop any further, now we might be talking about a team that can crack the top 10. Now we might be talking about a team that can make some playoffs and perhaps get in a position where then when they get an opponent that can give them 2 or maybe even all 3 maps that they want in a best of 3, now are they able to upset and not just be like a potential team, but who never actually go far in the tournament.